It's a pleasure to have you join me on this virtual journey. Welcome. Greetings, viewers. Get ready to immerse yourself in the world of Roszaidi Osman in this video. Roszaidi bin Osman born is a Singaporean drug trafficker who is presently serving a life sentence for trafficking in diamorphine or pure heroin in October 2015. Roszaidi and 4 others, including his then-pregnant wife, were all arrested and charged with capital drug trafficking, though eventually, in January 2019, only Roszaidi and 1 accomplice out of the remaining 4 were found guilty as charged and sentenced to death. The remaining 3, including Roszaidi's wife, were given jail terms ranging between 25 years and life. Following an appeal in 2020, the co-accused on death row was acquitted of the charge and escaped the gallows, but Roszaidi's conviction was upheld. However, Roszaidi was temporarily reprieved from death row and granted a retrial to review his sentence on the grounds of diminished responsibility. After the High Court restored Roszaidi's death sentence in his raid trial, Roszaidi filed a second appeal, and by a rare split decision of 3-2, the Court of Appeal allowed Roszaidi's appeal and commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment in December 2022. Let's zoom in on personal life and understand its implications. Born in 1972, Roszaidi bin Osman, who had at least 1 younger brother, grew up in Singapore. His father was a drug addict who smoked marijuana or cannabis, and due to this, Roszaidi first smoked cannabis at age 10. And he often consumed drugs with his friends, sometimes even using the pocket money originally intended for buying food given by his mother and grandmother to purchase drugs. He also began to consume other drugs since age 12, ranging from heroin, heroin and diamorphine. Likely because of his frequent drug abuse, Roszaidi did not perform well in school. He failed the primary school leaving examination PSLE thrice before he furthered his studies in secondary school, but he dropped out of school after his secondary 2 year at age 17, and he even dropped out after completing only 1 year of training at the Vocational and Industrial Training Board, now renamed as Institute of Technical Education or ITE. Roszaidi married his wife Azila bint Zainal aged 32 in 2015 since March 2015, and together, the couple had 1 daughter as of October 2015, and their second child of unknown gender was born sometime after Roszaidi's arrest in 2015 for drug trafficking. Brace yourself for an enlightening exploration of criminal records as we dive into its profound implications. As a result of his heavy drug use, Roszaidi had spent nearly 18 years of his adulthood from 1990 to 2015 behind bars, including at the drug rehabilitation centers and prison. These criminal records were first revealed in April 2022 while Roszaidi was appealing to commute his death sentence for diamorphine trafficking. On 1 March 1990, when Roszaidi was around 18 years old, he was detained at the Drug Rehabilitation Center for 6 months on account of his drug consumption. On 28 May 1990, he was placed under drug supervision for 24 months. On 26 June 1990, Roszaidi spent another 6 months at the rehabilitation center. On 14 June 1991, when he was around 19 years old, Roszaidi was under drug supervision for another 24 months. On 24 January 1992, when Roszaidi was around 20 years old, he spent a third period of 6 months at the rehabilitation center. And on 16 January 1995, when Roszaidi was around 23 years old, he was once again placed under drug supervision for 24 months. Just over a week later in the same year, on 24 January 1995, Roszaidi was found guilty of 1 count of unauthorized possession of a controlled drug and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. A few months later, on 24 July 1995, Roszaidi was again detained at the rehabilitation center for 6 months. On 16 July 1997, Roszaidi was placed under drug supervision for 24 months after his release. On 4 October 1997, Roszaidi was caught consuming morphine and thus sent back to the rehabilitation center for 6 months. 2 years later, in 1999, Roszaidi became addicted to heroin and he maintained the habit until 2006, the year when he had to undergo surgery. On 23 February 2000, 28-year-old Roszaidi, who was caught with morphine in his possession, was convicted of illegally possessing a controlled drug and drug consumption. For these two offences, he was sentenced to 5 years and 3 weeks imprisonment, including a concurrent 2-year sentence for the first charge. He also faced a third charge of consumption of cannabinoid derivatives, which was taken into consideration during sentencing. On 28 July 2003, Roszaidi was released from prison on parole for good behavior, but he was placed under drug supervision for 24 months for his consumption of morphine. During his time at the program, Roszaidi worked as a production officer in Jurong Island, and he kept the job for 3 years. In 2006, Roszaidi was assigned to the Institute of Mental Health's Addiction Department for a drug rehabilitation program. However, even then, he continued to smoke diamorphine regularly. On 2 February 2007, after being caught in 2006 for importing a controlled drug called buprenorphine, Roszaidi, then 35, was brought to court and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with 5 strokes of the cane. He was also convicted of 1 charge of consuming buprenorphine and was sentenced to a concurrent jail term of 7 years and 6 months, along with an additional 6 strokes of the cane. 2 further charges, one of buprenorphine consumption and one of buprenorphine importation, were taken into consideration during sentencing. He served 5 years out of the sentence before being released on parole in 2011. He consequently stayed away from drugs for a year before being caught again for possession of diamorphine or pure heroin. He was later placed under drug supervision for 24 months for his consumption of buprenorphine on 3 December 2012. He was also sentenced on 24 August 2012 to 3 years imprisonment. Sometime in 2014, when Roszaidi was around 42 years old, he was paroled and released early for good behavior. At that point, Roszaidi's father died from unknown causes in the same year prior to Roszaidi's release. Thereafter, he worked at a chemical company for a few months under the work release schema program that helps integrate ex-prisoners and find them work. Sometime in December 2014 or January 2015, Roszaidi resigned from his chemical company job and worked at a flour company for roughly 6 months before he quit this new job in May 2015. Shortly before he resigned, Roszaidi's grandmother and mother died, and according to a psychiatric report, Roszaidi's sadness over the double deaths of his grandmother and mother had directly led to a significant increased rate of drug consumption, and he also began to exhibit depressive symptoms since then. Moving ahead, let's uncover the hidden gems within background and arrest and discover their significance. Prior to July 2015, Roszaidi first met a man nicknamed Iskanj in prison while serving his 7.5-year sentence for buprenorphine trafficking in 2007. In July 2015, he decided to help Iskanj to deliver drugs. During each delivery, Roszaidi, who never had enough money to buy drugs, would siphon off a portion of these drugs for his personal consumption. On 6 October 2015, Roszaidi was going on a shopping trip with his wife and their daughter when Iskanj contacted him to deliver another package of drugs. Together with his 22-year-old friend Mohammed Azli Mohammed Soleh, Roszaidi went to Bulim Avenue, with Azli driving him to his destination. Upon his arrival, Roszaidi collected a red plastic bag from 2 Malaysian men, Aishamuddin Jamaluddin and Suhaizam Kariri. Court documents reveal that the bag contained 2 packets of diamorphine or pure heroin and 3 packets of methamphetamine. After Roszaidi collected the drugs, Azli drove him back to his Jurong West home, where Roszaidi passed the package to his wife. Shortly after, officers of the Central Narcotics Bureau CNB arrested Aishamuddin after they were observing him in surveillance and followed his lorry. The arrest of Aishamuddin also led to the capture of Azli, Roszaidi, Azidar and Suhaizam. Altogether, 5 people, including Roszaidi and his wife, were arrested and charged for drug trafficking. The amount of diamorphine trafficked by Roszaidi weighed erg, which was more than twice the minimum amount of AUG that mandated the death sentence under the Misuse of Drugs Act MDA. Although the death penalty was the only sentence available for capital drug trafficking, suspected drug traffickers could still be spared the gallows and sentenced to life imprisonment on the condition that they either acted as couriers and provided substantive assistance, or that they suffered from diminished responsibility at the time of the offence. Before the start of Roszaidi's trial jointly with Azli and Aishamuddin, both Azidar and Suhaizam were separately dealt in court for their roles in Roszaidi's drug smuggling case. Suhaizam pleaded guilty to a reduced charge for trafficking not less than erg of diamorphine, and the second charge of trafficking not less than erg of methamphetamine was taken into consideration for the purpose of his sentencing. Suhaizam's sentence for his conviction was 25 years imprisonment and 15 strokes of the cane. He had since lost his appeal against the sentence. As for Azidar, who was pregnant with their second child at the time of her arrest, she was similarly convicted of trafficking not less than erg of diamorphine. She also pleaded guilty to one count of consuming methamphetamine and consented to have a third charge of trafficking not less than erg of methamphetamine taken into consideration for the purpose of sentencing. Azidar was therefore sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. As we progress through this video, let's shift our attention towards death penalty trial and uncover its hidden depths. On 13 March 2018, 46-year-old Roszaidi Osman and two of his accomplices, 33-year-old Aishamuddin Jamaluddin and 25-year-old Mohammed Azli Mohammed Soleh, jointly stood trial for their respective roles in smuggling erg of diamorphine. During the trial, Roszaidi's defense was that he never knew about the contents of the drugs he was asked to deliver by Iskan's request, but his statements proven otherwise, and the prosecution argued that Roszaidi had not rebutted the legal presumption of him having knowledge of the nature of the drugs he delivered, and he should be convicted as charged. As for both Azli and Aishamuddin, Azli denied the prosecution's contention that he abetted Roszaidi to traffic drugs, and his defense was he never knew that the exact contents of the drugs turned out to be diamorphine, although he conceded that he knew methamphetamine was among the contents of the drug package collected by Roszaidi, and Aishamuddin himself also denied having any knowledge that he was delivering diamorphine and only admitted to smuggling methamphetamine. On 21 January 2019, the trial judge Chu Hon-tek of the High Court delivered his judgment, ruling that the prosecution had proven their cases against the trio beyond a reasonable doubt, and thus rejecting the defenses of all the three defendants, but he also accepted that Aishamuddin's charge should not be different from that of Suhaizam due to them having shared the common intention to deliver the drugs to Roszaidi. As such, Justice Chu found both Azli and Roszaidi guilty of capital drug trafficking and sentenced both of them to death, since both Azli and Roszaidi were not proven to be merely acting as couriers at the time of the offence. Aishamuddin, on the other hand, had his charge reduced to a lesser offence of trafficking not less than erg of diamorphine, the same charge Suhaizam was convicted of, and he was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment and 15 strokes of the cane. As we enter this new phase, let's navigate the complexities of appeal against conviction and sentence and discover its practical applications. After the both of them were sentenced to death, Roszaidi and Azli each filed an appeal against their conviction and sentence. At that point, Roszaidi engaged a renowned criminal lawyer, Eugene Thuraisingham, to represent him during his appeal. The defense was not the only side that filed appeals in relation to the trial verdict. The prosecution, at the same time, lodged an appeal against the trial judge's decision to reduce Aishamuddin's charge and also appealed against Aishamuddin's 25-year sentence. These appeals were heard in a separate court hearing. Welcome to the next segment, where we explore verdict and remittal of case and its significance in our journey. On 23 April 2020, the Court of Appeal's 5 judges, Chief Justice Sundaresh Menon, and 4 judges of appeal, Judith Prakash, Taeyong Kwong, Andrew Fang and Stephen Chong, delivered their judgment regarding the appeals of Roszaidi and Azli through a virtual court hearing conducted via Zoom. This virtual court hearing was conducted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in Singapore and the 2-month nationwide lockdown, which suspended all physical court sessions and led to the Singaporean courts switching to virtual hearing of court cases. In the case of Azli, the Court of Appeal found that although Azli knew that Roszaidi was delivering drugs, he never had the exact knowledge on the nature of the drugs and what were the contents of the package, and he likely only found out that Roszaidi was dealing with diamorphine after his arrest and during his interrogation. There was no evidence to suggest that Azli had agreed to help Roszaidi to smuggle drugs in spite of his knowledge of Roszaidi's involvement in drug trafficking, aside from his lack of knowledge of the nature of drugs. Therefore, the 5-judge Court of Appeal felt that it was unsustainable to uphold Azli's conviction on the basis of legal presumption of knowledge. In conclusion, the Court of Appeal's 5-judge panel set aside Azli's conviction and sentence and granted him a full acquittal of all charges. On the other hand, Roszaidi's appeal against his conviction was dismissed. Still, the 5-judge panel noted that Thoraisingham had submitted new psychiatric evidence to support a newly raised defense of diminished responsibility on Roszaidi's behalf, and they therefore agreed that the evidence, while it should be admitted earlier during the trial, should warrant a retrial with regards to the appropriate sentence Roszaidi should receive. As such, they ordered that his case should be remitted to the High Court for a re-sentencing hearing, in order to fully assess the psychiatric evidence and decide if Roszaidi should be given a life sentence on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Meanwhile, the prosecution's appeals regarding Aishamuddin's case were both heard and allowed by the Court of Appeal 3 months later on 17 July 2020, and 35-year-old Aishamuddin Jamaluddin's sentence was increased to life imprisonment with 15 strokes of the cane after he was convicted of the revived original drug charge. The Apex Court agreed that the charges against Suhaizam for erg of diamorphine and Aishamuddin for erg of diamorphine were not inconsistent charges, given that these charges formed part of a single coherent world of facts, meaning both of them shared the common intention to traffic erg of diamorphine. Given that Aishamuddin was acknowledged and certified to be acting as a mere courier while committing the crime and provided full cooperation during investigations, he evaded the death penalty and instead sentenced to incarceration for life, though he still had to undergo his original caning sentence of 15 strokes of the cane. Brace yourself for an in-depth analysis as we navigate through High Court retrial and its far-reaching implications. On 12 October 2020, Roszaidi's retrial took place before the original trial Judge Chu Hon Tek at the High Court. Drive Jacob Rajesh, a consultant psychiatrist engaged by the defense, testified in court that Roszaidi suffered from 2 psychiatric illnesses, namely major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. Relying on the fact that Roszaidi consumed drugs since his childhood and his emotional loss over the double deaths of his mother and grandmother, Drive Rajesh said that Roszaidi began to manifest symptoms of depression before he committed the offense of drug trafficking, and at the time of the offense, the severity of his depression had worsened by then, and the combination of depression and substance use disorder which explained his escalated drug use and lack of abstinence from drug use had substantially affected his mental responsibility. Drive Bharat Saluja, the prosecution's psychiatric expert, stated that he agreed with Drive Rajesh that Roszaidi indeed suffered from both the aforementioned disorders. However, he disagreed that Roszaidi's mental faculties had been substantially impaired by one or both of these disorders, and found the symptoms of these 2 illnesses relatively mild at the time of the offences, and Roszaidi was therefore not suffering from diminished responsibility. On 1 February 2021, Justice Chu delivered his judgment at the end of Roszaidi's retrial. The judge accepted that Roszaidi indeed suffered from both depression and substance use disorder at the material time. However, Justice Chu held that Roszaidi's mental responsibility was not substantially impaired at the time of the offense, because Roszaidi was able to make reasoned choices and conscious decisions to smuggle drugs on Iskan's behalf, and he was able to plan and execute plans and arrangements to smuggle drugs in a logical and organized manner. Therefore, Justice Chu ruled that Roszaidi did not suffer from diminished responsibility and hence, no order shall be made to convert his original sentence of death to life imprisonment. As a result, Roszaidi's death sentence was reinstated and he was thus sent back to death row. Turning our focus to final appeal and commutation of sentence, let's explore its key elements. After the Ray trial ended, Roszaidi appealed against the Ray trial decision in April 2022, seeking to once again review his case, and his defense counsel Eugene Thorasingam, Johannes Hadi, Shobnichandran and Fedas Aaron Tanyongzong raised the same arguments in favor of Roszaidi's case. On 1 December 2022, the Court of Appeal made its final verdict relating to Roszaidi's sentence. By a majority decision of the 5-judge panel officially commuted Roszaidi's death sentence to life imprisonment, which therefore allowed him to escape the gallows. Out of the 5 judges, 3 of them Chief Justice Sundaresh Menon and 2 judges of appeal Belinda Ang and Judith Prakash opted to allow the appeal, while the remaining 2 judges of appeal Andrew Fang and Stephen Chong dissented. In the majority judgment, which was read out by C.J. Menon, the 3 judges were of the opinion that Roszaidi's mental responsibility was indeed substantially impaired by the combination of both his conditions of major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. They stated that Roszaidi's psychiatric condition indeed had a real and material influence on his mental state, mainly his ability to restrain himself from purchasing and consuming drugs, his decision to smuggle drugs as a means to feed his addiction, and passing the package of drugs to his wife. Centering on his decision to hand over the package to his then heavily pregnant wife, who was innocent of the crime and incriminated for the crime, his actions were done irrationally and out of impulse with considering the consequences, which showed the impairment of his decision-making ability. The judges also determined that Roszaidi's decision to traffic drugs to supply some for his use was not a reasoned choice or the consequence of rational judgment, but rather the product of a disordered mind, as caused by the substance use disorder and worsened by his depression. They also noted that having suffered the double losses of his mother and grandmother, Roszaidi's rate of drug consumption escalated since he used drugs to lessen his heartbreak, and his depressive symptoms were notably surfacing at around this timing, which also explained his inability to find and maintain stable employment. Given that these disorders had substantially distorted Roszaidi's mental responsibility at the time of the crime, the majority agreed to revoke Roszaidi's death sentence and ruled that he should be sentenced to life in prison. In the minority decision, however, both Justice Fang and Justice Chong disagreed that the conditions were so severe to the extent of reducing Roszaidi's mental faculties, and did not, in their opinion, believed that there was a causal link between his depression and his increased rate of drug consumption. The minority concluded that Roszaidi's rational judgment was not sufficiently impaired at the time, and that he was thinking in a logical and organized manner, as demonstrated by how he noticed the weight of drugs being more than usual and thought of sending some to his wife for safekeeping, a decision which was also purportedly motivated by Roszaidi's self-preservation. They pointed that it appeared to be an unintentional result when his wife became implicated for this incident. As such, they decided to dismiss Roszaidi's appeal in their minority judgment and uphold his death sentence. But since the majority decided to commute Roszaidi's sentence, the minority cannot depart from the court's final decision on sentence. In conclusion, in accordance to the majority judgment, 50-year-old Roszaidi Osman was spared the gallows and he was thus resentenced to life imprisonment under Section AB of the Misuse of Drugs Act (MDA). Roszaidi was spared the cane due to his age of 50 at the time of his race sentencing, and the MDA also prohibited caning for drug traffickers suffering from diminished responsibility. Prepare yourself for an eye-opening discussion on aftermath in the upcoming portion of this video. In the aftermath, Roszaidi's case was described to have set an important milestone with regards to the sentencing guidelines under Section UP of the Misuse of Drugs Act (MDA), because it ruled that even if a person appeared to be capable of making rational decisions, he was still entitled to a defense of diminished responsibility should his mental responsibility was substantially impaired when he decided to commit drug trafficking, since his actions constituted as the product of an impaired mind. When 39-year-old delivery driver Mohammed Shal Abdul Latif was hanged for drug trafficking in August 2023, Roszaidi's case was brought up as a recent example of drug traffickers escaping the death penalty under the MDA on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and it was also discussed that the death penalty for drug traffickers was a complex issue due to the narrow definition of the abnormality of the mind and strict eligibility conditions for a trafficker to avoid execution, as demonstrated in the case of Nagantran Kelvin Dharmalingam, whose death sentence was upheld despite his claims of intellectual disability, after the courts deemed he did not suffer from diminished responsibility, which was a contrast to Roszaidi's case. After losing his appeals, Nagantran had since executed on 27 April 2022, in spite of the international pressure to not carry out his hanging. In an interview in February 2024, Roszaidi's former lawyer Eugene Thuraisingham spoke about the mental struggles of lawyers who handled cases where a person was at risk of the death penalty, as it carried the huge burden of helping a client to evade the gallows, and the outcome of the client being sentenced to hang would be emotionally devastating to a lawyer who spent time and effort to defend them, as well as the fact that the lawyer formed a bond with the client and his or her family throughout the legal process. Thuraisingham described Roszaidi as one of his most memorable clients, and he said that his successful efforts to help Roszaidi escape the gallows brought about a sense of warmth and accomplishment. Thuraisingham revealed that since the end of Roszaidi's resentencing, he and his associates involved in Roszaidi's case would constantly receive electronic letters from Roszaidi, who remained in contact with them on festive occasions, and Roszaidi would express his gratitude to Thuraisingham and the other lawyers each and every time he wrote to them. Thuraisingham recounted that whenever the letters came, Roszaidi's sincerity made him recall that his efforts to save Roszaidi were all worthwhile. Since October 2015, Roszaidi remains incarcerated in Changi prison while serving his life sentence. Although life imprisonment in Singapore was meant to be a term of incarceration for the remainder of a convict's natural life since the landmark appeal of Abdul Nasir A. Muhammad on 20 August 1997, Roszaidi is still entitled to be released on parole after completing at least 20 years of his life term. Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of this video.